Hi everyone, my name is Matthew Montgomery, and my dissertation is entitled Inheritance in the Asaph Psalms, Interpreting a Unifying Theme. I completed my PhD at Trinity College, Bristol, in Bristol, England, as a distance student, under the supervision of David Firth, and was examined by Dirk Heumann and Peter Hatton. I also had the honor of serving on the one and only IBR Student Committee during my studies. In the dissertation, I argue that inheritance constitutes a, not the only, theologically significant and unifying theme within the Asaph Psalms, which constitute Psalms 50 and 73 to 83. And much of this has been overlooked in previous scholarship. While previous studies have emphasized conflict as a central motif, my work demonstrates that inheritance terminology, drawn from the semantic field of Yerash, Nachal, and Helek, clusters in the Asaphite collection. These 12 Psalms, only 8% of the Psalter, contain 20% of the Psalter's inheritance terminology, and the terms are found in rhetorically strategic positions, often at the beginnings and ends of these Psalms. Through a text-immanent literary approach, I examined the rhetorical, structural, and theological functions of inheritance within the Asaph corpus, showing how its distribution creates thematic cohesion. As the Asaphite collection in Book 3 of the Psalter in its final form responds to the theological crisis of the Babylonian exile, it addresses whether Judah remains God's inheritance, or whether God still belongs to God's people. The analysis reveals that in the Asaph Psalms, inheritance is primarily relational and covenantal, rather than merely territorial and pertaining to sociological inheritance of possessions. Inheritance in the Asaph Psalms serves as a lens for processing communal trauma and sustaining eschatological hope. So, the primary contribution of this study is a close literary analysis of the Asaph Psalms that shows inheritance to be a unifying theme of the Psalm collection. Additionally, by illuminating this underexplored theme, the study contributes to Psalter studies, interpretation of Book 3 of the Psalms, and broader discussions of inheritance in the Hebrew Bible. My first exegetical chapter argues that inheritance terminology plays a climactic role in the rhetoric of Psalm 50, which is separated from the rest of the Asaph Psalms. More specifically, those who invert portions of the Decalogue in verses 18 to 20 and reject their covenant relationship with the God of Israel have their inheritance, chelek, with adulterers. By the end of the poem, we find that this inheritance refers to a final climactic judgment in which the God of Israel tears the wicked apart as if God were a predatorial animal, with the implication that the righteous have a better inheritance. I also show that much of the early reception history of Psalm 50, including select Greek manuscripts and the Targums, evidence this eschatological reading. The following chapter argues that the same inheritance term, helek, is at the heart of the climactic conclusion of the next Asaph Psalm, Psalm 73. Psalm 73 uses helek to explore the ultimate end of the righteous. In Psalm 73, verses 16 to 17, the psalmist understands that while the wicked seem to thrive in their present position, it is ultimately precarious. The God of Israel will judge the wicked and will vindicate the righteous, with the result that the righteous shall have the God of Israel as their chelek forever, in a relationally intimate and idealized future hope, in verse 26, even if their heart and their flesh fail. Thus, Psalm 50, at the opening scene of the second Davidic Psalter, describes the eschatological fate of the wicked, which is described as their portion, chelek. Psalm 73, on the closing scene of the second Davidic Psalter, describes the righteous having the God of Israel as their chelek forever, even if their heart and flesh fail. Thus, helek is used by the first two Asaph Psalms on both seams of the second Davidic Psalter to explore the eschatological inheritance of the wicked, Psalm 50, and of the righteous, Psalm 73. The wicked in Psalm 50 reject their covenant relationship with the God of Israel by inverting the Decalogue and thus receive judgment as their inheritance. In contrast, the righteous sufferer in Psalm 73 remains faithful to God even in crisis and receives an intimate relationship with the God of Israel as their inheritance forever. These strong lexical and thematic ties make a compelling case as to why Psalm 50 is located apart from the rest of the Asaph Psalm group on the other side of the second Davidic Psalter. It is very likely that this arrangement creates a literary lens or emphasis via which one can productively read the second Davidic Psalter. In the next chapter, I argue that the relationship between Psalm 73 and 4 is intentional and rhetorically meaningful. The juxtaposition of these two poems also constitutes the first occurrence of what I refer to in the study as juxtapositions of problematization. Inheritance terminology, helek, is found at the climactic conclusion of Psalm 73, where the psalmist has the deity as a relationally intimate inheritance forever, even if their heart and flesh fail. In the opening lines of Psalm 74, the psalmist begs God to remember the tribe of God's inheritance, Nachalah, because the nations have come into the land of Israel and destroyed God's temple. Thus, the idealized conclusion of Psalm 73, where the psalmist has the deity as an eternal inheritance, is strongly questioned by Psalm 74. Does the God of Israel even remember the covenant relationship with God's people? Will God act to deliver them? Thus, an assessment of the lived experience of the psalmist in Psalm 74 calls the idealized hope of the righteous inheriting God forever at the conclusion of Psalm 73 into question. Inheritance terminology functions as a thematic link with great interpretive significance at the seams of these two psalms. The way in which Psalm 74 problematizes the idealized hope of Psalm 73 with its harsh lived experiences creates a nuanced, meaningful, and rich theological conversation about God's faithfulness to the people of the covenant inheritance in the midst of hardship. Now, inheritance does not feature in every Asaph psalm. In fact, the poems that do not contain any inheritance terminology are clustered into two groups, Psalms 75-7 and Psalms 80-1. These gaps thus create three clusters of inheritance terminology, Psalms 50-74, 78-9, and 82-3. While I explore the implications of these gaps and clusters for the Asaph collection in the dissertation, I only have time to focus on the poems containing inheritance terminology in this video. Here, it suffices to say that inheritance functioning as a unifying theme for the collection does not require that it occurs in every single poem. My next exegetical chapter focuses on the three occurrences of Nahalah found in the last three stanzas of Psalm 78. I show that the final occurrence of Nahalah in the poem is found in the context of God building a temple on Zion, like the heavens and the earth which he has founded, and setting up an idealized Davidic kingship, quote, to shepherd Israel, God's inheritance. It was argued that the most fitting way to read the psalm in the final form of the empty psalter is as a message of hope for God's people as they grappled with the Babylonian exile. God has, quote, vented his wrath on his inheritance, verse 62, in the past, and even abandoned cultic dwellings in the past. The psalm uses Shiloh as an example. This, however, does not mean that God has given up on the covenant relationship with the people of inheritance. God established God's dwelling on Zion after leaving Shiloh, and God can do the same thing again in the wake of the destruction of Solomon's temple. God is committed to dwelling with the covenant people, even if there are major bumps along the road. In the next chapter, we encounter another juxtaposition of problematization. Here, I observed that Nahalah occurs in verse 1 of Psalm 79, as the nations come into God's Nahalah with militant aggression. Like Psalm 74, 79 uses Nahalah to invoke the idea of God's covenant relationship with the people. It is unthinkable for the psalmist that God will do nothing as the haughty nations destroy what belongs to God, since this would show God to be impotent in comparison to the gods of the nations. And yet, the lived experience of Psalm 79 is the exact opposite of the idealized end of Psalm 78. At the conclusion of Psalm 78, God is dwelling in an idealized temple on Zion with an idealized Davidic king, shepherding God's people of inheritance. In Psalm 79:1, though, the nations have come into God's inheritance and killed God's people of inheritance en masse. Thus, Nahalah functions as a catchword between Psalm 78 and 9 and problematizes the idealized relational inheritance between God and God's people at the end of Psalm 78 with the brutal lived reality of Psalm 79, where God's inheritance, temple, land, people, is decimated. In the following chapter, I argue that the inheritance verb nahal is at the heart of the climactic conclusion of Psalm 82. As the psalmist laments injustice all around them on earth, the God of Israel is in the heavenly council of El and is equally upset about the injustice experienced by the psalmist. The God of Israel demands that the sons of Elion work justice on behalf of the marginalized, and then, due to their corruption, sentences the spiritual beings to mortality, just like any one of the princes of humanity are mortal, in verses 6 and 7. Verse 8 concludes the poem with a triumphant eschatological vision, in which the God of Israel will arise and take all the nations as God's inheritance. In place of the unjust Elohim that enabled injustice in human societies, the God of Israel will one day rule in perfect justice. In my final exegetical chapter, I argue that Psalm 83 partially problematizes the idealized inheritance hoped for at the end of Psalm 82. Although the end of Psalm 82 hopes for the God of Israel to inherit all the nations, Psalm 83 opens with a complete reversal of this, where a larger-than-life coalition of nations is coming to wipe out God's people and, quote, inherit for themselves, Yerash, the pastures of Elohim. However, we as readers of the empty Psalter and of the Asaph Psalms know that this is a dangerous course of action for the nations to take. Having previously read Psalm 82, we know that the God of Israel has the power to condemn even unjust gods to mortality, and that God has the power and authority as the creator of the cosmos to inherit all the nations. This is not good news for those who might try to inherit for themselves the pastures of Elohim and to wipe out God's people. Psalm 83 climactically closes the Asaph Psalms with the God of Israel going to great lengths to protect the people and land of God's inheritance. The closing strophe of the psalm describes God's defeat of the coalition of nations, and it is by far the longest and most thorough description of destruction in the Asaphite Psalter. For our psalmist, it is sure that God will miraculously deliver God's people from eschatological destruction. For the Asaph Psalm group, when life experiences in the present, like Psalm 73, 4, and 9, do not match beliefs about and expectations of God as expressed in Psalm 75, 6, 82, hope for God to act in the future and be true to God's character and covenant people remains secure. God will eschatologically inherit all things in Psalm 82 and defend and protect God's people and land of inheritance in Psalm 83. Thus, while the Asaph Psalms do not solve the crisis repeatedly lamented in the collection, it does, often with idealized inheritance terms placed prominently in the poems, hold out hope for a future when God has delivered God's people of inheritance and again dwells with them in the land of inheritance. This survey of preceding chapters clearly shows that inheritance is a unifying theme in the Asaph Psalms, with key inheritance terms occurring near the beginnings and ends of 7 Asaphite poems, often functioning as a catchword between the poems. It is also clear that inheritance, when used theologically, is often relational. To be God's people of inheritance and to dwell with God in the land of inheritance suggests a mutual, exclusive, and intimate relationship between deity, land, and people. Thus, concepts of covenant and inheritance are deeply related and mutually informing. Furthermore, the repeated problematizations created by juxtaposed Asaph Psalms create a nuanced theological dialogue amongst the collection. God can be questioned, and yet God's faithfulness can be celebrated. Disaster can be mourned, and yet victory in the future is certain. God will act on behalf of God's inheritance and will inherit all things even while the nations destroy that inheritance presently. Why did I choose this topic? I chose this topic because it coalesced really nicely with the previous research that I had done. I had done some work in my master's thesis on inheritance in the Hebrew Bible and found that it was a severely underexplored topic and theme in scholarship. And so it was an area where I felt like I could make an original contribution that showed an ongoing trajectory in my work without having to reach too far to come up with something new or original. I also find the concept meaningful just because of the connections it has with covenant theology and a relationship with the deity. That kind of relational theology and wrestling with the tensions between beliefs and hard real life experiences I find really meaningful, especially since I also serve as a pastor. And so these sorts of conversations, questions, tensions are very pastoral and come up regularly in my work. How did writing a dissertation contribute to my spiritual growth and impact my Christian faith? For me, it was an enriching and deepening experience. Just sitting with these same 12 poems for several years and getting into the details of the tensions and the wrestle was just encouraging because it's a reminder that the Christian faith and scholarship is not having all the answers. That's not what it's about. It's about the journey, it's about the process, it's about the authentic struggle when life is difficult and confusing and you don't have all the answers. So I see that very much in this psalm collection. That's very much been a part of my journey, and again in my work as a pastor, giving people permission to have similar sorts of wrestles and journeys. What tips do I have for students who are starting or trying to finish a PhD? A few things. People are there to help you. Your advisor is there to help you. Don't be shy about asking them questions, about sending them your work, engaging, initiating conversations. Librarians are there to help you to track down stuff that's hard to find. There are support groups like this one that are here to help you. There are tech people at your institution that are there to help you when something is not going right. So don't be afraid to be vocal and reach out to people. Another tip is to start early with your footnoting and your organizing of citations and sources. Regardless of what source organization system you use, start that early so that you don't have to go back and find details and bibliographical information for 600 footnotes at the end. Doing that along the way will do yourself a lot of favors. Thirdly, I would say don't be afraid to ask questions. Nobody knows it all, and everyone is scared of admitting that and asking questions. It is okay to say, actually, advisor, I'm not sure, I'm not familiar with that concept you just used or that author you just referenced. Can you break that down for me? That is going to help you, it's going to enrich your work, and it's a good practice in humility to say, hey, I don't know what that means, can you explain that to me? I think that's all I've got. I hope this video was an encouragement and a blessing to you on your PhD journey. Godspeed. Blessings.